Today is a very special session for me personally and for Spin State. We're joined by Ryan Gottfredson, one of the world's leading authorities on vertical development, and someone whose work has profoundly shaped how I think about leadership, mindset, and what actually drives sustainable growth in people and in organizations. Ryan's work focuses on our being side of leadership, our internal operating system of mindsets, mental models, an identity that shapes our behavior, especially under pressure. So this conversation sits at the heart of Spin State's People First operating system, because you don't change outcomes by trying harder. You change outcomes by upgrading your level that you're operating from. So Ryan, look, it's a real privilege to have you with us. Welcome.
Honored to be here. I consider you to be a great friend, David. So it's just, I love that you asked me, and I'm excited to connect with everybody here on the call.
Just a few little points. If everybody could put their microphone on mute, apart from Ryan, of course. Halfway through the session, we'll open up for a few questions. You mean vertical development is like the golden thread through my program, Ryan, and everybody on the call will be very familiar with the term.
Great.
And then at the end, there'll be some Q&A as well. So look, I'll jump into my first question then. So for leaders who are hearing the term vertical development for the first time, what is vertical development and why is it fundamentally different from the way most leadership development is approached today?
I found learning about, I don't know about any of you, right? So it sounds like you're familiar with vertical development. I don't know about any of you, but putting a label on vertical development has been life-changing for me, because it opens up, when we start to understand it, it opens up a developmental strategy that I just didn't even know was an option until I learned about vertical development. So one of the ways that I like to communicate and kind of define what vertical development is it's helpful to recognize that we have two different sides of ourselves. So think about a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. On our horizontal axis, that's what I call our doing side. This is our level of talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And if you think about most of our development efforts, it's about improving our knowledge and skills. Think about our education systems, our athletic programs. Most of our organizational development efforts are, here's what you need to know and here's what you need to do, right? And that's beneficial, but that's a form of development that's called horizontal development, improving along with our knowledge and skills. But there's another side of ourselves that I don't think many people are as connected with, and it's what I call our being side. Now, our being side is the quality of our internal operating system. Oftentimes, we could talk about this as our character, our mindset, our psyche, our emotional regulation abilities, right? How reactive we are. And it's when we elevate along our being side, that's what's called vertical development. And what I've just learned is that very few development efforts focus on vertical development. But if we could get there, it could be transformational. So what I've learned is if we improve along our doing side, horizontal development, that could be incrementally helpful. But if we improve along our being side, that could be transformational. So let me give you just a couple of quick analogies that are helpful for me. One is to think about horizontal development as adding apps on an iPad. That's great because it broadens the iPad's functionality. But it doesn't necessarily improve how effective that iPad operates. So vertical development is more about upgrading the iPad's operating system or our operating system. Or another analogy would be horizontal development is adding tools to our tool belt, and vertical development is upgrading the person wearing the tool belt. So hopefully that's a decent start. David, I don't know, you want to add anything to that?
I mean, one of the things that really struck me about your work is that most leaders aren't failing because of effort or intelligence, but because they're operating from a level of thinking that can't handle the complexities that they might be facing. And that kind of maps directly into what we see in founder-led businesses today.
What are common leadership or even just personal issues that you see people have? I'm going to add to that is maybe some emotional intelligence issues, right? What's the best way to deal with or rise above these issues? Is it focusing on the doing side or focusing on the being side? Because here's what I've learned. You could teach me kind of some tips and tricks to be patient. But when the heat is on, right, and I've got a deadline or something, my body revs up. And so when we think about our being side, it is more about how our body wants to function within stress, uncertainty, and complexity. Now, let me flip this, let's flip it the other direction. Why don't you type in the chat box, what are some characteristics of really great people or leaders? Resilience, charming. All right, I like that. Calm under pressure. Kind, generous, positive, happy. They inspire others. Are these characteristics more connected to their doing side or their being side? I think that they're almost all of them are the being side. Yeah, right. And what I mentioned earlier is that while we could kind of unpack this here, again, most development efforts don't really focus on our being side. And so that's why I say learning about vertical development has been life-changing for me, because it's brought up a new development strategy that has been transformational. I believe, I could almost see, I feel like I've been on a vertical development journey over the last 10 years. And I could see that there's been different stages or milestones within that journey. And each of these stages and milestones have something in common. And what they have in common is I go deeper inward. So what I've learned is that the deeper we go inward, our greater capacity to elevate along our being side.
Thank you for that. And it's great to see the engagement as well. So I really appreciate all of that. So look, let's talk about levels of sophistication. So you've shared that around 85% of leaders operate at a moderate level of sophistication. So what does that mean in practice, and how does it show up in leadership behavior, Ryan?
The first question that I often get when we talk about doing side and being side is, I think we almost all know how to measure our doing side. And so then the question becomes, how do we measure along our being side? And there's a range of different ways for us to think about it. There's things that are very rudimentary, like we could talk about how reactive is somebody, or what is somebody's width of their window of tolerance. That might get an indication of their altitude along their being side. But some of the most sophisticated thinkers around this being side come from the field of adult development psychology. So I'm going to take you on just a little bit of a history lesson. Developmental psychology has been a field of study from the 1880s up until now. And for the vast majority of this history, the primary emphasis has been on childhood development stages. So if you've ever taken a human development course, you would know that as children go from infants to adults, they go through a number of different developmental stages. And so that's been the focus, partly because the assumption has largely been when people hit adulthood, then they stop developing. And so in the 1960s, there's a select few developmental psychologists that started to ask the question, can adults develop? And if so, are there different adult development stages? And what they found was quite fascinating. So they found that yes, adults can develop. And in fact, there's 3 adult development stages. But the third thing that they found out that's really fascinating is that while adults can develop, they find that most don't develop. So if we think about 3 different stages here, I call them in my work, Mind 1.0, Mind 2.0, and Mind 3.0. Because at each of these different levels, our body's internal operating system is programmed to fulfill different needs. Okay, so let me walk through these different needs, and we'll come back to some of the percentages that David brought up. So at Mind 1.0, our body is wired for safety, comfort, and belonging. And this is most people. In fact, 64% of adults operate here, in a place where their body is wired to move away from discomfort. Right? That's just almost a natural tendency, and that's where 64% of adults operate. The next level up is when our bodies, we're no longer wired for safety, comfort, and belonging. We're wired to stand out, advance, and get ahead. In fact, we're willing to be unsafe, uncomfortable, and not belong in order to stand out, advance, and get ahead. So as we make this shift from Mind 1.0 to Mind 2.0, not only do our needs shift, but what we find is that people in Mind 1.0 are more dependent thinkers. They're kind of like, you tell me what to do and I will go and do it. People in Mind 2.0 are more independent thinkers. They kind of develop their own set of personal ideals, beliefs, values, and now they want to run with those. And so this is where we see most leaders. 85% of leaders operate at this Mind 2.0 level, where they're wired to stand out, advance, and get ahead. And then the Mind 3.0 level, at this level, we no longer want to stand in and we don't want to stand out. What we're wired to do here is to contribute, add value, and lift others. So now there's a big distinction between Mind 2.0 as you make that jump from Mind 2.0 to Mind 3.0, because when you're at Mind 2.0 or Mind 1.0, our focus is on us, ourselves, either us standing in or us standing out. It's only when we get to that Mind 3.0 level that now almost the reason for our existence is for something bigger than ourselves, to create value out into the world. And as we make that shift from Mind 2.0 to Mind 3.0, one of those shifts is we move from being an independent thinker to being an interdependent thinker. And so what we find is that what research has revealed is that only 1% of adults operate at Mind 3.0 and 8% of leaders. Now, I don't think that's the cap for, what percentage of people can get there. I just think we don't get more people there because most people don't know about vertical development, which is kind of why I feel like me and David are on a mission to kind of share with folks what it's all about and how it can be impactful.
So let's talk about just a good continuation from that point, like plateaus and pressure. So when leaders hit a plateau personally and within their organization, what's usually happening beneath the surface?
Do you have an example that comes to mind, David? I've got one in my mind, but I'm curious if you have an example of somebody maybe you've recently worked with that you've seen hit a plateau.
Yes, in my last business, we had raised a considerable amount of private equity funding, and we were on a fairly aggressive growth phase. And part of the work with Spin State, especially with the smaller founder-led businesses, Ryan, you would argue that your professional and your personal purposes are more closely aligned. But when you get into a larger organization, that kind of professional why and that, the personal why and the professional why can tend to grow apart. And you've maybe got eight or nine people around a boardroom table. Some of them are more inclined to work towards the profits, while some other people are looking at other different things. So you become torn as a byproduct of all of the decisions that you've made in the past. And that's part of the reason of why Spin State exists. It's to catch those solopreneurs or those founder-led teams, so we can shine a light on the stuff that's really important before they start making those decisions that they then have to live by. When things get too big. Hopefully that makes sense, right?
So what I'm feeling into this, and this is, I think at our core, if we are stuck or at a block, we can create assumptions. These are like if-then statements. So what I'm sensing from how you felt in that corporate environment, if I follow more closely to my purpose, then your body believes I will, fall out of favor with my organization. Right? Is maybe an assumption that goes on there. And so at the root of any of our blocks is, we can ultimately unpack it to an if-then statement. This is part of our body's programming. Remember, our being side is our internal operating system, which is built up of programming. And all of us has programming there to either help us or sometimes hold us back. But here's what's tricky about this, is that a lot of our programming, particularly the programming that kind of prevents us from moving forward, is our programming is self-protective in the short term. Such as, let me give you some examples. If I step into a learning zone challenge, then my body's belief is that I will fail, look bad, and other people will lose respect in me. So there's a lot of, in fact, I find that 60% of leaders have some sort of that assumption, or ultimately fear, a fear of looking bad. And so a lot of leaders, as a way to protect themselves in the short term, is they hold on to what's worked in the past, and they're reluctant to embrace something that might work better in the future. But it's just unproven. And so that's really scary. Another fear might be, or assumption might be, is if I admit that I'm wrong, then other people will see me as less credible. And that makes sense for a lot of people, right? And within this assumption is I don't ever want to admit that I'm wrong because I want to avoid the short-term discomfort of being seen as maybe less credible. But the thing is that if we can admit that we're wrong, that actually opens us up for finding truth and thinking optimally. Another example might be if I take risks, then I will lose something. And so a lot of people operate in a mode in which they never are willing to take risks, and therefore they never lose anything, but they also never really gain anything. Because what I've learned is that if we want to get from where we are now to where we want to go, guess what? We're going to have to take risks. That's part of the journey. And there's going to be wins and there's going to be losses along the way. And if we are only willing to experience wins, we will never put ourselves out there. And so what I hope, one of the ideas that I'm hoping is coming through in these examples that I'm giving is that and this is another way to think about our being side altitude. At the kind of the lower end of our being side altitude, our body is wired more for self-protection. And when our body is wired for self-protection, our body responds to situations in a way that protects us in the moment, but may hold us back in the long term. As we go higher along our being side, we become more wired for value creation, meaning we are more willing to step into uncomfortable situations in the short term for greater learning, growth, development, and impact in the long term. And so hopefully that idea came forward with some of those examples. So to maybe summarize, I talked about it first as assumptions that our body carries that are self-protective. Ultimately, these are fears or mental blocks that we hold, and we all have them. The question then becomes, how clear are we about these assumptions, this programming, or these fears that we have that are serving us in some ways because they protect us, but generally they're holding us back in some really significant ways. Anything to add there, David?
Can you explain or give us examples of what changes typically when a leader starts working on who they are and not just what they do?
And here's, I think, one of the most powerful lessons that I've learned about vertical development. Because when we do horizontal development, it almost feels like the harder we push, the more we gain. Well, with vertical development is not about pushing harder. It's actually about letting go of something. Oftentimes, that's the letting go of the need to look good, to be right, to avoid problems, or to get passed up. Right. So one of the things that I see with a lot of leaders that I work with is that they are really focused on results, on outcomes. And when they're really focused on results and outcomes, they have a really hard time delegating effectively. In other words, they micromanage. Why do they micromanage? Is because they're concerned that if I delegate something to somebody else and I don't fully trust them to hit the results, that's going to reflect poorly on me, and I don't want anything to reflect poorly on me. And so most of the time when leaders are struggling with micromanagement, the reason why is because they are a little bit overly preoccupied with how they look or appear or how smoothly things operate. And in reality, in order for a micromanager to go from where they're at to being an effective kind of delegator or empowerer, they actually have to let go of the need to look good for things to run smoothly. And until they can let go of those needs, they're going to continue to hold tightly to their micromanagement style or strategies.
I really appreciate you sharing that. So I think let's move on to vertical development and blind spots. I think blind spots are probably one of the most human things that there are. So how does vertical development help leaders see their own blind spots, especially the ones that are invisible to them at their current level?
As I said earlier, I've just learned that the deeper we go inward, the higher we could go in terms of our vertical altitude. And the reason why I say that is because the deeper we go inward, the more we uncover our blind spots. And we're really not going to be very successful at rising above our blind spots, our fears, our self-protective tendencies, unless we become aware of those. And so one of the tools that I use in the work that I do is I have a mindset assessment. So maybe many of you have heard of it. It's free on my website at ryangottfredson.com. And we assess 4 different sets of mindsets. And what I found is that I've had over 50,000 people take this mindset assessment. And I found that only 2.5% are in the top quartile for all 4 sets of mindsets. So what that says to me is most of us have some mindset work to do, myself included. And so it's not uncommon for me. Well, I'd say it's very uncommon for me to use this assessment when I work with organizations. And what's not uncommon is that I get leaders that get pretty heated after taking the assessment and they didn't like their mindset assessment results. Let me give you an example of this. So a woman, she brought me in to work with her team. She's kind of a sales leader. She had a team of about 30 different sales reps, and she had all of them take my mindset assessment in preparation for a workshop I was doing with them. And so I was preparing for the workshop, and it got down to the day before. And when I work with groups, I'll kind of have them take my assessment, and I'll create an aggregated collective mindset report. And so I was in the process of creating that report, and I realized that the leader of this group didn't take my mindset assessment. And so I had her cell phone number, and I called her up and I said, hey, do you mind taking this assessment really quick? It takes about 5 minutes. Just take that so I can include your results in our workshop tomorrow. She said, yeah, no problem. So she goes on and takes it. And not too long after, I get an email from her, and this is in the evening, the day before the workshop. I get an email from her, and she is hot. She is thinking, I don't agree with this. I can't believe, what came forward in these results. I don't think, and this is what she said, I don't think I'm going to be at the workshop tomorrow. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what a train wreck. And I it's evening, workshops in the morning. I'm thinking there's not a lot I could do here. I'm just going to let her sleep on this, and I'll touch base with her in the morning. So anyways, I wake up the next morning, and I see an email in my inbox from her, and it came in at like 2 a.m. And in that, I pull up the email, and I'm thinking, oh, great, here we go again. But what she says was, I apologize for my last email. After talking things over with my husband last night, I think it will be a good thing for me to be involved in the workshop today. And so what I found is that all of us, our internal wiring, whether it is more self-protective or value creating, it feels right to us because it's serving us in some ways, right? It might either be protecting us in the short term, or it's something that allows us to kind of succeed more in the long term. So I've just found that when we dive into ourselves at a deeper level, ultimately we're going to uncover some of these places where we are wired a little bit more for self-protection as opposed to value creation. And until we discover those things, it's going to continually hold us back. So I just feel like vertical development inevitably, it has to start with self-awareness.
Tasha Ulrich, and I've went down that self-awareness rabbit hole, and it's incredible. She wrote a book, Shatterproof. It was brilliant, actually. It's probably one that I'll share with the group further down the process in the program.
Research, she's found that, and you can put your answer in the chat box. What percentage of people do you think? What percentage of people think that they are self-aware? So if they're asked a question, are you self-aware or not? What percentage of people say yes, I'm self-aware? I'm seeing some 70%. Let's see if we get anybody else. 70. So the answer is 95%. 95% of people think that they are self-aware. Now, what percentage of people are actually self-aware? And what our research finds is that it's only 10 to 15% of people are actually self-aware. So this is a huge disconnect. And the way that she says it, that means that about 85% of people are lying to themselves about themselves. Now, I don't fully agree with that statement, because here's kind of the way that I've learned to think about it, is I think that most people think that they're self-aware because they have clarity on their doing side. But the only way we could actually be clear, self-aware, is if we have clarity along our being side. And just most people don't have that level of clarity because it's not something most people have ever really focused on.
Recently, I've just finished your latest book, Becoming Better. And this question is kind of from knowing to becoming. So many leaders know what good leadership looks like, but struggle to live it consistently. So how does vertical development close the gap between knowing and becoming, Ryan?
Let me give you just a pretty simple example. How many of you have demonstrated that you can listen really effectively to another person and validate their perspective? I think almost all of us have demonstrated that we have that ability, right? But I imagine, if you're anything like me, is that you don't always do that. So a lot of times when it comes to like our communication abilities, I think that most of us have the knowledge and skills to communicate effectively. But I don't think we always do. And the reason why is less about our doing side, and it's more about our being side. Our capacity, what is our capacity to listen when we are stressed out, when we are hangry, right? That says more about our being side than our doing side. So what I've learned is if we have two different people, the same kind of width along their doing side, but they're at different being side levels, the person who is higher on their being side, they get more out of their doing side. And so what I've just learned is that a lot of leaders in organizations are really talented. They're really far out there along their doing side, right? How do most people get promoted? Is because they could do stuff really well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the being side capacity to lead effectively.
So final question in this run, and then we'll open it back up again for a question or two. So when organizations invest in vertical development, what shifts do you see in culture, trust, and long-term performance, Ryan?
One of the first things that we see happen in organizations is we do get a clearer sense of purpose, of vision, of mission, of values, because that's where Mind 3.0 leaders focus. And when we have those, that creates the optimal environment for our people to grow and thrive. And so when that occurs, when we have that optimal environment, then what we see is we see greater traction. We're more on the same page and we can make progress more quickly and more readily. We're also more agile at the same time, and we could better navigate complexity, right? Because of that agility. And then I think another big value of this, and maybe it's implied in everything I just said, is that there's greater vitality or life in the system, right? We've all been into organizations where you kind of walk in and you almost kind of feel like it's methodical or it's dead. And then there's other organizations or enterprises that we walk into and you think, oh, this is so light. This is so vibrant. It is alive. And what we find is that when an organization is run by these Mind 3.0 people, that's what we find. We find life in the system. And I love that idea. And I feel like, we could even ask ourselves, how much life is there in our system, in our family, in our interactions with our customers? Because that's probably a decent signal of our being side altitude.
You mean Spin State's built around a people-first system? You mean if leaders don't evolve their internal operating system, then purpose becomes superficial, vision becomes abstract, goals are mechanical, and accountability then is ultimately forced. But when then leaders elevate on how they make sense of the world, I guess everything downstream, people, decision, execution, all changes.
How, we probably all, as your stats said, believe that we're self-aware, but how do we know that's a blind spot or not? And whether, so is it like doing online quizzes? Is it about asking ourselves questions? Is it about asking other people their belief system of us? And is that somebody you know well or somebody you don't know well? How do we actually go about finding our blind spots?
And I think all of the above can help. I found, books, reading different books about different vertical development related topics has surely been helpful for me. There's different exercises some of these books have in them. Of course, I use my mindset assessment, and then I've got a vertical development assessment that just helps with the process. But at the end of the day, if we really want to dig into this, I found that there's an exercise in this book that I use a lot in my coaching. It's called Immunity to Change, driven by Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy. Robert Keegan's one of the kind of the leading researchers in the vertical adult development space. And he's got an exercise, I call it in my practice, just a vertical development exercise. And it's an introspective deep dive that allows us to get to those. I talked about those if-then statements earlier. And if we had more time, maybe we could walk through this, but I'll give you a high level process of this and of that exercise. Is what we do is we start with an aspiration that we have for ourselves. So let's just say I want to become a better leader. Okay. And then that's where we start. And we're going to dig into some layers, right? What are our behaviors, thinking, and mindsets that are holding us back from that aspiration? Okay. So that's the aspiration. When we drop down into the behavior level, we can ask ourselves, what are we doing or not doing that's holding me back from this aspiration? So maybe if I want to become a better leader, something I'm doing is I'm micromanaging, right? We kind of have used this as an example. So that's at the behavior level. Then we could dive down into the thinking level. And where we want to start there is by asking why. Why do we micromanage? Well, I could say, well, I need to make sure that my work gets done on time and in a customer-friendly way. So that's where we start. And then we need to say, what pain am I trying to avoid? I'm trying to avoid, maybe in this instance, disappointing my customer. And when we identify the pain that we're trying to avoid, we could flip that into a commitment. So if I'm trying to avoid disappointing my customer, I'm committed to pleasing my customer. Now, is there anything wrong with this commitment, pleasing my customer? No, of course not. But it is a commitment that I have that is causing me to micromanage. And so while it's a good commitment, it's also a commitment that is getting in my way. And so what we discover when we discover these commitments is we have one foot on the gas in the form of our aspiration to become a better leader. But we also have one foot on our brake in the form of this commitment. And this is why I said what I said earlier is I think most of the time when we're not making progress towards our aspiration, we almost kind of feel like, oh, it's because I'm not pushing hard enough on the gas. And the reality is we almost always are. The reason why we're not moving forward is because we're pushing too firmly on the brake in the form of this commitment. And so the only way for me to become a better leader in this instance is to actually care less about pleasing the customer. I've actually got to, and not that I'm going to drop that altogether. I've just got to care less about it, because as I pull my foot off of the brake, then naturally I'm going to move forward. And so when we discover this dynamic, everything that I've kind of walked through, then we could create our if-then statement. And we're going to take the opposite of that doing. If I don't micromanage, then, and we could insert the pain I'm trying to avoid, then I will make my customers upset. And that's the belief that my body carries. If I don't micromanage, then I will make my customers upset. So that's the belief that my body has. That's my mental block that's getting in my way. Now, that mental block is, we've got to ask ourselves, is it true? And maybe even a more better way to ask that is, what percentage of that is true? Because it's not 100% true, right? I can envision a situation in which I don't micromanage and yet my customer is still pleased. But so we could cognitively recognize that it's not 100% true, but our body doesn't necessarily feel that. And so we could develop activities to help our body learn that it's maybe more true or maybe less true than what we had originally anticipated. And so that's the thinking level where we uncover a mental block. But then is there a mindset that drives that mental block? And in this instance, it would probably be a prevention mindset, where we're more focused on preventing bad things from happening than fulfilling a purpose or reaching goals, which is more of a promotion mindset. So that's just hopefully I explained that pretty quickly, but in a clear enough way to help you see that. And this is why vertical development is somewhat difficult to do on our own, is because it's really hard for us to do that kind of deep dive work, this introspective work, without having some sort of a partner or coach or therapist to kind of help us to peel back the layers and dig into what are our blocks and our self-protective mindsets that are holding us back. But once we can surface those, now we've opened up the opportunity for us to do something about it. And I recognize I'm being long-winded, but I think there's maybe a valuable insight that could come up here. Is what I've learned as I've been doing this work for myself, as well as helping others do the same, is that vertical development work at its very core is about healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts. Is because when we do this deep introspective work, the reason why we have these mental blocks or self-protective mindsets is generally because we've been hurt in some way in our past that has led us to take on this programming. And so when we do this work, I consider it almost be sacred work. It is really meaningful work because what we're doing is we're helping people to heal. And the more healed, the more that we can heal ourselves, the more we show up as a value creator in the world around us.
Like vertical development is healing our minds, bodies, and hearts. That's really powerful stuff, actually.
There's kind of different, we can think about this, there's different layers of healing work that we can do. And I just think it's valuable to recognize that, right? There's kind of surface level healing strategies, like meditation is a surface level healing strategy. It is designed to help us better regulate our body's nervous system. And so I call that's like a surface level strategies. There's deeper level strategies. That's, for me, this is doing mindset work, because we start to become aware of the programming of our internal operating system and try to make upgrades there. But that's still not the deepest level. The deepest level is oftentimes where we really need to bring in some sort of professional support, like a therapist, for example. So psychological therapy, trauma therapy, neurofeedback therapy, even psychedelic assisted therapy is something that's out there. So these are, I don't think that we start at those deepest levels, but what I found is if we really want to kind of do this work, we got to start at the top and work our way down. And it's a journey. That's why I say over the last 10 years for me, there's kind of been different stepping stones, different milestones. And it's because I've taken my journey deeper and deeper. And in the process, healed and healed. And I feel like because of that, I'm able to show up as a better version of myself. But am I done? No, not at all. I think vertical development is a lifelong journey. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm going to take a positive mindset and say that's a good thing.
I completely agree. It can only be a good thing. I think as human beings, we always want to see the destination, but actually by removing the destination and just appreciating the journey is 90% of it. So look, if you could leave this group with one key reframe or insight about their own development as leaders, or something to reflect over the next few weeks, what would it be, Ryan?
To me, one is just kind of maybe solidifying or giving more clarity for you that vertical development is a developmental strategy that is available for us. And if we walk down that vertical development path, it can be transformational. I think, just hammering in on that idea that we just talked about is ultimately it is about healing our minds, our bodies, and our hearts.
So look, today reinforced something essential. Leadership growth isn't about adding more tools. It's about becoming a bigger container for the complexity, pressure, and responsibility that we all carry. Ryan, thank you so much, not just for today, but for the body of work that continues to shape how leaders grow. And I'd like to thank everybody who has joined us today for Spin State Live. I really appreciate it. That's been an incredible 1 hour. So thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you creating this space, David. This has been great.
Excellent. Well, look, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you.